Screencast 2 this week, I want to look at the role of resources in the strategic management process, in the strategy development process. And I want to start off with a quite simple diagram which tries to explain this, and we'll refine this and develop this in subsequent slides. So the first thing I want to say to you is that the resources and the competencies, so the strengths that you have and the weaknesses that you will have, will determine or shape the strategies that you follow. So there is a kind of, role for resources and competencies in determining the shape of the strategies that you will follow, the things that you will do. Okay, so resources and competencies can shape strategies, and really this is using your strengths to pursue strategies, but strategies also need to build to overcome weaknesses and turn weaknesses into strengths. Strategies also need to seek to build and maintain resources and competencies to ensure competitive advantage or superior performance. So we've got a kind of circular flow here. So this is a kind of strengths defined strategy. So the strengths that you have will determine the strategies that you follow and the major strategic actions. But strategies should also at the same time consider building resources and competencies. So this is a kind of overcoming weaknesses dynamic here. And this is a exploiting or leveraging strengths dynamic in this direction. So I want to talk to you about, matching resources and competencies to environmental factors. So in your work with Mark on the environmental and industry context, you will have been able to identify the key success factors. That is, the things that an organisation must be able to do in terms of its external environment, the challenges it must be able to face, the things that consumers value. You should be able to identify key success factors. Now, through internal analysis, you will develop a view of the resources and competencies that the organisation has. And the first thing, once you've done this, is to say, well, is there a match between what the external industry and environmental context is throwing up and the resources and competencies that we have? Are we in a good position? Do we have the right strengths and weaknesses to address the key opportunities and threats which are generated outside the organisation by the wider environment and the industry context? If the answer to that is yes, then you are heading, or more likely to be heading, for high performance. So if there is a good congruence between the resources that you have and environmental conditions, you are headed probably for high performance. Overall, the outlook is rosier for you. If there isn't a good match, then you are heading for poor performance. Okay, now, the reality is that there is never a perfect match between the environment and the internal resources and competencies of the organisation. So therefore, quite simply, the role of strategy is to identify strategies to close the gap between the resources and competencies that you currently have and the external environmental conditions. Yeah. Now, obviously, if you are down at the poor end of performance on this diagram here, it is critical that you identify strategies to close the gap and make them effective. Okay, so it's more critical down here that you identify strategies to close the gap, but no organisation is going to have a perfect fit. So all organisations will need to identify some strategies to close the gap. And going back to our previous slide, this is about strategies building resources and competencies to try to ensure a good match between the external and the internal environment for organisations. Okay, so I want to talk to you about types of organisational resources. And what this diagram says, and this comes from Robert Grant's book, Contemporary Strategy Analysis, and this is as useful a book as any other to read in terms of background for this. What we don't in this module do is recommend one particular textbook, because there are many textbooks out there which are very similar, but this particular diagram comes from Robert Grant's book. And what Robert Grant says is that the resources of an organisation can be understood as, or classified as, tangible, intangible and human, right? Okay. And that this helps generate what is the organisation is capable of, and should determine your strategy taking into account the external factors which are generated from the industry and the macro environment, and that strategy should really aim to generate competitive advantage for you. But anyway, back down to the bottom of the diagram, because this is what we're really concerned with here. And this is a starting point. We will see that, I think we can do better than this when we come to models which are specific to the sport industry. But he classifies resources as being tangible, intangible and human. Now, these will vary from organisation to organisation, but let me just talk you through these fairly quickly. So, an important resource is financial resources, and this can be cash, securities, so the kind of shares that you have issued and the value of those, and borrowing capacity, so your capacity to raise money. So why is cash important? Well, in terms of strategy moving forward, a strong cash position means that you are in a position to invest in developments which will allow you to maintain your competitive advantage. It will allow you to invest in training, in facilities, in technology, to expand into new areas of business. So having a strong cash position puts you, or having a strong access to borrowing, puts you in a position to respond quickly to those opportunities which require expenditure and which require finance in order to be able to move. So having large amounts of cash is obviously a key resource and a key competitive advantage. And you'll find that some organisations are in a strong financial position, and you'll find that others are in a weak financial position because they don't have much cash. They have maxed out their borrowing capacity, and they will struggle to react to changing market conditions. And particularly we hear of businesses that are performing poorly, and they need to borrow or need to try to borrow money to shore up their business, and they can't get access to that, and the business collapse. So obviously a lack of finance and a lack of cash, a lack of borrowing capacity limits your strategic options and is a source of weakness. So, physical. Well, what can physical mean? Well, really in sport, this means largely facilities. Okay, so it can mean if you are a national governing body, what's the quality of your facility infrastructure, both for participation and performance and elite? Okay, does it allow you to achieve what you want to do? So having poor quality facilities at the grassroots participation level is probably not going to help you increase participation. It can be a constraint on demand. So a lack of supply of good facilities is a constraint on demand, which means participation might not grow. at the performance and the elite level, not having access to state-of-the-art facilities might mean that your athletes can't train and perform at their highest level, at their best level. So we can understand the English Institute of Sport and the development of that in the last 20 odd years in England as a reaction to international benchmarking, which was done by the UK after the Atlanta Olympics, which were the worst Olympics that Britain has had in terms of performance, and identifying other models, including the Australian Institute of Sport, and saying, okay, we need a model which looks like that, which includes great facilities for our athletes to train in. Okay. Now, in professional sport, this can mean, obviously, the stadia that you play in. And we know that for many sports, match day revenue is an important source of income. And by increasing capacity and improving facilities at stadia, you can help increase match day revenue. Okay, so for other areas of business, physical plant could include the ability to manufacture goods, to make goods. Now, what we'll see in the sport industry is that for organisations like Adidas and Nike, having factories is not an important part of their business for them. They outsource this, they get someone else to do it. Okay, but those are kind of tangible resources. Now, intangible resources become a little bit more difficult to get your head around. But let's talk about the first intangible resource, technology. So, a good example of technology within the sport industry is Nike. So Nike actually, on some levels, doesn't define itself as a sports manufacturing company. It defines itself, much as Apple does, as a kind of innovation company. They're about innovation, developing innovative products. And the way they do this is they invest heavily in research and development and technology to enable them to produce goods which have features which customers and consumers value and will pay a high price for. So investment in technology can allow you to charge a high price because of the features. It can allow you to produce superior goods to your competitors. If you look in facility management, and we look at the case of budget gyms, we can see that budget gyms have developed strength in technology to allow them to operate their facilities at low cost by replacing people job roles with technology. So what do they have? They have biometric or PIN entry. You join online, so there is no sales team, and they capture your data there. They staff their venues with with very few members of staff, 1 or 2 members of staff, and they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they invest in security around their facilities, including cameras and so on, to allow them to manage their facilities in a safe way. So what we can see is that technology can be used to either increase the quality of your products and the prices that you charge in the case of Nike, or in the case of a budget gym, it can allow you to do things more efficiently and decrease your costs and improve your kind of competitive advantage that way. Other intangible resources are reputation, so brands and relationships. So this is interesting. Obviously, you know, we've got big brands in sport: Nike, Adidas, Real, Manchester United, Liverpool, so the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan, LeBron. So we've got kind of big brand names which are important. And we've also got relationships as well. And, you know, I've talked about participation sport and the value of partnership and relationships. That can be a real source of strength for an organisation which is seeking to increase participation through having effective partnerships with other people that can develop opportunities to participate. And I've said earlier on in this lecture that for not-for-profit organisations, relationships and partnerships are really important, because we're not seeking in that sector to crush the competition. We're not seeking to try and force them out of business so we can have better profitability. We're seeking to increase choice and availability of options for people in order to participate. So intangible resources in terms of partnerships and relationships for not-for-profit sport organisations can be really important. And has your organisation invested in those and developed those partnerships and relationships over the years? Now, culture. I think culture is going to be very difficult for you to actually, for many of you, to actually be able to say much about. Although we do know that for some sport organisations, there are issues around culture. We know that there are certain things around governance and culture in some national governing bodies. So, for example, in gymnastics in this country, we know that there's been some kind of issues around safeguarding of young people and bullying behaviour by coaches, which is hugely detrimental to the sport. And that's been seen in other sports over the time. So governance and culture can damage your reputation and actually create weaknesses in terms of sponsorships and parents being willing to let their children participate in the sport. So that can actually create some real problems. And we also know that some sport organisations can have dysfunctional cultures. So I'm a New York Knicks fan, and that is seen as a fairly dysfunctional NBA franchise, and the franchise owner is seen as being fairly destructive. James Dolan is called, and creating lots of problems with players and staff and people, and creating a bit of a problem around the organisation. And then there are other organisations, and the New Zealand All Blacks are ones that have been mentioned as having a good positive culture which has driven success. British cycling is a successful sport in this country, which is deemed to have a successful culture. And Mark Taylor would tell you that Manchester City and City Group have got the right culture to succeed. I don't know about that. I've not seen the evidence for that. Human. So this is kind of skills, know-how, capacity for communication and collaboration and motivation. I think this is difficult for you to be able to assess looking from the outside in, and I do recognise that's a problem. What kind of evidence might you be looking for? You might be looking at training programmes, recruitment programmes. If you're looking at football, you might be looking at the kind of capacity or the skills of the team that you've got playing for you. But this is going to be more difficult, and this is going to be something that we're going to need to talk about as the module progresses and as you start to engage in doing internal analysis for your organisations. So you've looked at this chart here, and you've come up with a list of resources: tangible, intangible, and human. Okay. Now, what you need to decide is, well, which of these are really important in terms of conferring some kind of advantage on my organisation? Because just as all external factors are not equal, some opportunities will be more important and more significant than others. Other threats will be more potentially damaging and more likely to happen than other threats in the external environment. Well, some resources that you have might be valuable in terms of generating competitive advantage, but others may be less valuable. And we have a framework which we can use for evaluating resources, and it's called the VRIO or VRIO framework. So it's a mnemonic. So V stands for value, and this says that the resource must be valuable in the sense that it can be used to exploit opportunities or neutralise threats in the environment. So it's got to be relevant, yeah? It's got to have value in terms of its relevance. There's no point in having something which is of value in a kind of abstract way if it cannot be exploited. Right? The R in VRIO stands for rarity, and this means that the resource has got to be rare amongst a firm's current and potential competitors. Okay, so if something's rare and scarce, we know that that tends to drive its value up as long as it's in demand, yeah? But if it's commonplace, it's got a relatively low value, yeah? So if you're collecting something, if you're a collector, then you want to collect something that's rare because it has higher value, because there's not that much choice in the marketplace. So the resource has got to be rare, unique, or difficult to actually find. And the other thing is that the I stands for imitability, and imitability or inimitability means difficult to imitate or copy. So the resource must be imperfectly imitable. So people might try to copy it, but they won't be able to replicate it exactly. Yeah? So it is going to be unique to you. So we've got to think about, some things, some business models are based on things which are definitely difficult to copy. Other business models are based on things that are more difficult to copy. So I think that the budget gym concept is actually, as a concept, fairly easy to copy. Yeah, you can see what's going on. You can see how gyms do this, and we'll look at their business models later in this series of lectures. And it's quite easy to copy that. Now, to copy what Nike do that's far, far more difficult, because you've got kind of brands there, and brand image is built up over years, and the organisation's culture contributes to this. And to copy a culture is very, very, very difficult to do. Yeah, so to copy some kind of fairly simple processes is not that difficult, but to copy things which are more complex and more intertwined and which have evolved over many years is more difficult. And the final letter in the mnemonic VRIO is O, which stands for organisable. And the resource itself won't give you any competitive advantage if you cannot organise it to capture value. Yeah. So there's a close link here to competencies. So competencies are the organisation's ability to develop processes which allow its resources to be exploited in the most efficient and effective manner. Okay. But I think it's worth just saying, so that resources themselves are not sufficient. We all know football teams or sports teams which have made expensive signings or expensive deals to bring star players, and it's not worked. That's not to say the player has not been right, but the kind of, the organisable of the way they're integrated into the team or other factors can actually mean that, that the signing doesn't work out, that the star player doesn't generate the change that some teams had hoped for. So let's just think about resources and competence again, just so that we're clear about the difference between those two things. So resources are the productive assets. So not just assets, but productive assets, things which can actually make a difference, which are owned by the organisation. And competencies are organisation-specific abilities to manage strategic resources in a way that creates competitive advantage. And this is often the way that business processes are designed and carried out. And when we come on at the end of this lecture, and certainly in more detail next week, we will look at a management concept called value chain analysis. And value chain analysis allows us to see how organisations create business processes that allow them to exploit strategic resources in a way that creates competitive advantage. So there's a kind of rationale here which says that if we start with acquiring strategic resources, so resources which are valuable, rare, inimitable and organisable, and we are able to develop real know-how in core competencies and processes, then we're more likely to succeed in the long term through building competitive advantage to deliver customer value. Okay, so resources combined with know-how about how to deploy those resources leads us to competitive advantage because we're delivering something that customers value. We're more likely to be able to do that. Okay, and let's just think about resources and competencies then, and business success and business failure. Right, so the first thing that we need to start off with is understanding what customers value, and from external analysis, those key success factors. And what we do then is kind of try to develop and deploy resources and competencies in the right way. Now, if we have inadequate or obsolete resources, if we have weaknesses in our resources, and if we have inadequate competencies or redundant competencies, if we've got weaknesses in competencies in our business processes, then we are headed for market exit, business failure, worst case scenario, or best case scenario is repositioning. And repositioning is thinking about what we're doing and trying to reposition ourselves to do something else in the industry. Right? If we have adequate resources, so that's not unique, they don't meet VRIO, but they're okay, and we have threshold competencies, and threshold competencies are those things which are a minimum standard within the industry, then that will lead us to a sustainable position. And what I mean by a sustainable position is that the business is likely to be able to survive. It might not thrive, but it will survive. And the ultimate goal for organisations is to acquire unique resources, to develop core competencies which exploit those resources most effectively. And this is likely to generate competitive advantage. So this is the holy grail of the resource-based view of strategy, that you acquire unique resources and that you develop core competencies in deploying those resources, and those two things together, unique resources and core competencies, give you competitive advantage. And as we've seen, some organisations might be able to acquire unique resources, a unique football player, but there aren't the management competencies to deploy that player as effectively, so you're not going to have competitive advantage. You might end up in a mid-table position, a mid-league position. Some other organisations have got great management and great processes, but they haven't got the cash, the financial resources to be able to acquire and develop, or maybe the right academy systems or player development systems to develop unique resources. So although there's good systems and good processes, they don't have the unique ingredients to put in, and they too will probably have a sustainable position, but they're not going to have competitive advantage. They're not going to be challenging for honours. And towards the bottom of the table, you've got organisations that have got weak teams and weak resources in terms of players, and inadequate or redundant management processes or management techniques and systems, coaching practices, and over the long term they're less likely to be able to succeed at the highest level. Okay, now I just want to say something to you about going back to this idea of you being on the outside looking in when you're doing internal analysis. Okay, and thinking about this idea about performance. Okay, because what this tells us is if we're looking at someone which has had a bad set of results, or an average set of results, or a great set of results, that is probably going to allow us to kind of impute or deduce some kind of observations or information about the resources and competencies that an organisation has. So what I'm going to talk to you is about an adapted resource-based view of trying to identify strengths and weaknesses. And this might sound complicated, but it's really not. And to get you started thinking about this, this is what I'd like you to do. So what I'd like you to do is to review your organisation's recent past performance. If you're a national governing body, this could be about your participation rate. It could be about your performance at the elite level. If you're a football team, it could be about financial results and business performance. It could be about on-pitch performance. If you're an Adidas or a Nike, or in the sports goods manufacturing or retail, you might look at financial performance and market share and information like that. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is review the organisation's recent past performance. You'll have to think about what sources of information exist to allow you to do this, and we'll talk about this in a minute. Is it good or is it bad? And what do you think good performance indicates in terms of the quality of your resources and competencies? And what do you think bad performance would probably suggest about the quality of your resources and competencies, right? So can you identify the underlying internal factors which might be contributing? Okay, because that will allow you to identify what you suspect are the sources of strengths or weakness within the organisation. Okay, so there will be external influences too on the success of the organisation, because if the environment has become increasingly competitive or dangerous with more threats, then the organisation may not be performing well. If there have been, if the environment has become less threat, the industry environment has become less competitive, and the environment has become kind of more kind to the organisation in terms of there are more opportunities than threats, they might contribute to different levels of performance. But what we're really concentrating on here is these factors, these factors here, reviewing the organisation's recent past performance, deciding if it's good or bad, and trying to identify what you think are the underlying internal factors that might be contributing. So really, what I try to say here is you're like a doctor taking a patient's history. So a patient will present to you with symptoms, and you'd take temperature, pulse, and say, well, are those results good or bad? But then you'd try and get underneath and say, what's going on here? So you're from the outside looking in. These are the kind of steps that you need to take. So what are some of the information sources? I know that Mark will have talked to you about a lot of these already, but here they are. Passport, Global Marketing Intelligence Database, and you can search under companies. You will certainly find Nike, Adidas and Under Armour on Passport GMID, but you might not find many other organisations. Market Line Advantage might allow you to drill down, and generally has, probably in less detail than Passport, but it has a wider range of organisations from the sport industry that you can look at. If you're not finding anything under Passport or Market Line Advantage, I suggest that you go to annual reports of companies and organisations. Generally, you can find information there, and generally it's good information. Many organisations produce very good annual reports, including overviews provided by chief executives and chief operating officers about what's going on, what the opportunities and threats are, what the strengths and weaknesses of the organisation are, what the organisation plans to do in the future to address any internal issues. Some organisations, and if you're looking at Sky, either Sky Sports or Sky Bet, the way that Sky produces its annual reports, it's for the entire empire. So it's, you know, Sky as an entire business unit rather than individual businesses. You'll find that a bit more difficult. Anybody looking at Virgin as a kind of health and fitness club has had difficulties because of the way that Virgin reports and the way its business is structured. So if you fail at that level, you may need to start looking in the business press and Fame and Amadeus to build up a picture. And I know that Mark has produced on Fame and Amadeus and PI Navigator and other sources of information, some tips for how you can use those for your internal analysis. Okay, so that's the end of that lecture, and that was quite a long screencast. But what we're going to look at next is a shorter screencast, which is the building blocks of competitive advantage. So how organisations can try to develop some generic competitive competencies around which they can then develop competitive advantage.